There we go. All right. Hi, my name is Taro Omiya. I'm here to do a presentation on how to survive Ludum Dare. Um, by the way, I got a lot of help from Jamie Stevenson earlier this morning, so I wanted to give a lot of thanks to him as well. He won't be joining in today. He has some busy schedule to take care of tonight, but he will be in tomorrow, and we will be having our webcam at the Tech Valley Game Space to show off everyone. So join in, fun, and so forth. Anyways, let's get back to business. So in regards to Ludum Dare, if there's like one thing that I want you to get out of it, if there's one thing that I think is the most important part about Ludum Dare, it's to have fun. We want when you're like attending any sort of game jam, the whole point of it is really to have fun and to really enjoy the act of making games, the act of really making anything at this point. This includes board games, video games. I know Ludum Dare does not discriminate between the two, so feel free to make a board game if you think you're not capable enough of making a digital game. Nowadays, I don't think programming is a requirement anymore. So if you're thinking like, oh, I can't program, that's fine. We can. There are now solutions possible to make games. So anyways, I want you to walk in Ludum Dare with a lot of anticipation and excitement. I would really pull away any sort of doubts or worries that you have, because honestly, that's only going to hurt you at this point. Just kind of wipe all that negative feelings away and just move on. Which leads to the second point. I think the second most important thing about Ludum Dare is that you should try to learn from it as much as possible. So for beginners, as an example, who just started on Ludum Dare, this is a great point to learn how to use a tool. It is also a great opportunity to learn how to work on a deadline. And it's also a great time to learn how to complete a game. This is especially great for people who's like, yeah, I've tried to make games before, but I could never really complete it. This is an event for you. It's a great, great, great learning moment to figure out, oh, how do I work towards a deadline? How do I say, okay, these things are more important than these stuff? How do I prevent myself from getting caught in feature creeps? These kind of game jams really help you in learning that. If you're already experienced, you've went to a lot of Ludum Dares before, or you've been to other game jams before like I have, this is still a great opportunity to learn a new tool. There's always still something more to learn. And this is also an excellent opportunity to make something different, to make something that's outside of your comfort zone, to experiment with new ideas. I myself is an experimental game developer. I like to make stuff that people don't expect, and this is just an excellent time to do that. The expectations tends to be on the lower end of things, so they're not expecting like Halo, or they're not expecting the best mobile game of all time. So it's great to have this opportunity to go in with an audience of low expectations and completely blow their mind with something that's new and genuinely different. I also want to address that it's fine to fail in the Ludum Dare event. I mean, I know a lot of people, when they join in the game jam for a first time or second time or whatever, and they realize they don't have enough time to finish the game, it's okay. It's completely fine. It's completely all right to do that. Ludum Dare is in the competition. Honestly, the prize that you get for winning by being top voted is bragging rights. So the fact that you haven't made a game is as inconsequential as the fact that you have made a game. There's almost no difference between the two. So you shouldn't be worried about that too much. You should try treating Ludum Dare as a shared experience. A lot of people online will totally understand your feeling if you didn't make a game. A lot of people online will totally understand your feeling if you made a really bad game. You made something. It's great. That's even better. That's not something that most people can talk about. There's also the fact that Ludum Dare comes in, 3 times every year, which is very frequent on the grand scheme of things. And there's also like a global game jam coming up next January, end of January. So if you're looking into kind of practicing on working towards a deadline again, you already have an opportunity to do that during January. Or basically you can go to compohub.net and find a game jam that's on your own taste. That has like a list of almost every jam I can think of on the planet. So I'm just going to go over the rules real quick, just to contextualize the rest of the slides a little better. The jam-specific points, the jam-specific rules, are that you can work alone or in a team. and you need to create a game in 72 hours. Those are really the only two restrictions. You're completely allowed to use outside resources, such as opengameart.org and all that kind of stuff. There's no restrictions on that. They do ask you that during the voting period that you opt out of those if you're using outside resources instead of internally created stuff. But other than that, it's very loose. This is kind of like a very typical game jam, minus the you now have 3 days instead of 2 days time frame. Is it not reacting? Okay, excuse me. Compo is the more popular and a more hardcore version of Ludum Dare. If you're uncomfortable with it, that's completely fine, but here are the rules real quick. You must work alone. Your game and all your content must be created in 48 hours, and the source code must be included. Sounds pretty hard, which is exactly why I'm having this presentation right now. It is. There are certain things that you need to be more concerned about when attending a compo versus in a jam, and vice versa. So I'll go over these subjects as we go along. Give me a minute as I take a drink of water. I'm going to say that, oh, by the way, thanks for the wait. I'm going to say that the one single most important thing about game jams in general, Ludum Dare included, and especially Ludum Dare actually, is time management. This is the #1 most important skill. It's far more important than being able to create artwork, more important than sound effects, more important than programming. It's time. You need to be capable of doing it. And honestly, at this point, right now, what I'm going to say is, right immediately after this presentation, what you want to get started is to prepare. Prepare for the jam, or prepare for the compo, because this is going to easily save the most amount of time possible. There's also the fact that you want to make sure you understand what takes up the time and plan accordingly to that. So speaking of what takes up the amount of time, here are some few things that immediately comes to my mind. Plan to stay healthy. You want to account for 16 hours or 24 hours for jam that you'll be sleeping. And by the way, I can't emphasize this enough. You want to sleep. Please don't go to this event and not sleep. It has hurt me a few times. I remember trying to drive back from Global Game Jam with 2 hours of sleep within the whole 3-day cycle. And I was hallucinating, so it can be really, really bad not to sleep. So don't make that mistake. Make sure that you're scheduling 16 hours or 24 hours of sleep when you're doing this event. Same thing for eating, food, that kind of stuff. Account for 5 or 8 hours spent on eating. And I would actually really consider taking takeouts or buying some instant lunches, because that's going to save a lot of time. And I mean, if you're trying to cook your own food, that's almost another hour spent on just cooking your own food. So I don't recommend that. I do recommend trying to get everything set up as soon and as quickly as possible. Again, this is part of the preparation. Also plan for bundling. By bundling or compiling, same thing. Account for the 1 hour taken for compiling for all platforms. Usually that's the amount of time it takes for Unity. Sometimes it's as easy as just bundling together an entire source code, but you want to at least kind of buffer yourself for about 1 hour to do that. And I personally recommend submitting at least an hour before the submission time. Excuse me. 1 hour before the submission time, because depending on where you're submitting the website, it can end up being bogged down because of the Ludum Dare upload traffic. So doing this, you want to kind of think ahead of time and be able to accommodate for possible disasters such as these. Now, do note that Ludum Dare in the rules do say that you are allowed to they give you a 1 hour buffer during a submission. So right at the deadline, you can try submitting your game an hour between the deadline and the hour after the deadline, but I wouldn't put the risk on that. I would definitely buffer at least an hour before the submission deadline so that you can at least meet the time before then and not have to deal with these headaches. So when you really take that into account, context-wise, you're looking for Compo as 23 hours taken for all the necessary stuff just to keep you healthy, just be able to have time to bundle your things. And that means that when you subtract that from the 48-hour total that you have, then you only leave with a measly 25 hours for Compo. Jam is not much better. You're taking up 34 hours for all the necessities, and you only have 38 hours left. So these are the kind of times you're actually looking at. You're not looking at 48 hours, really. You're looking at 25 hours, and you're trying to manage your time so that you can make a game within the 25-hour to 38-hour time frame. So how to be prepared? The best way to be prepared, honestly, is to devote yourself on a tool. When you're declaring your I'm in post, you're effectively saying that, hey, I'm going to be using these tools, and you're going to want to just stick on those tools. I would also highly recommend checking out tutorials. If you don't know how to use said tools, you should look up tutorials on how to use them. They're going to save a lot of time because you don't want to be learning these kind of things during the jam. Speaking of resources, this Reddit thread here called Pocket Knives for Game Developers. They have a lot of free tools up there. These are generators, so it works both for Compo and jams. So I highly recommend checking out that link there. If you haven't decided on a tool yet, here are the tools you want to look for. I highly recommend looking for game engines. If you don't know programming, Construct 2 is by and far the most recommended one I've heard of, so I recommend it too. Game Maker is a pretty darn good one. I personally use Unity for 3D games. It's probably the fewest free 3D game engines I've seen, and some more. You can always Google these kind of stuff. Art tools, GIMP and Paint.net are the most recommended. If you want to make sprites, Aosprite is really good, I've heard. If you want to make 3D models, animations, so forth, Blender is really good too. Sound creation, I personally use BFXR and Audacity. BFXR itself creates a lot of sound effects, generates a lot of chiptune sound effects, so that's really useful, while Audacity is an audio editor. And music composing, I am not a music composer myself, so I'm sorry that this list is very short. LMMS is a free version that I heard was really good, and GarageBand is what I use. GarageBand on the iPad, which is actually pretty darn cheap. I think it's less than $10, so you can try using those tools as well. Again, Google is going to be your friend in this case. But yeah, like I said, game engines, art, sound, and music composing are going to be your main go-tos. These are like the tools that you want to list out and decide on. Back to time management. Usually when I do these game jams, I divide my development by phases, and each phase will be as long as a half a day. So the first half a day for me is brainstorming and prototyping. The second is the feature implementation. Third is the level construction, and the last one is polish. Now these are, I'm calling like each phase as a half day, but you can be a little flexible about them. Usually for me, the level design, the level construction phase is the longest, and the polish tends to be the shortest amount of time. So, you know, use what works for you. This is how I like to view my development periods as. Excuse me as I jug a little bit of water again. So let's go over through these phases very kind of in detail, very carefully. The phase one here, brainstorming. When you're walking into a Ludum Dare, you want to walk in with an open mind, and that means, by that I mean like you want to walk in Ludum Dare without a game idea in mind. Why is that? The thing is that when the Ludum Dare theme gets announced, and it tends to be hard to predict what theme it's going to be. The Ludum Dare theme gets announced, you really don't know which one it's going to be, and honestly, if you're coming in with a game idea, then what's going to end up happening is you're going to try to really force this game idea into what the theme means, and most of the time this doesn't quite work, especially if you have, like, let's say you have a first-person shooter game that you had in mind. You're like, oh man, I'm going to make a first-person shooter, and the theme turned out to be there is no floor. well, crud, right? You're kind of now stuck with trying to figure out how to make a first-person shooter that has no ground to walk on. So you don't want to make that kind of mistake. Basically, so instead, it's a much better idea to just say, nope, forget it. I'm not going to even bother. I'm not going to even think about what game I'm going to make until the theme is announced. And you're going to be way better off doing so. The other plus side of this is that by doing so, you're also leaving your mind open to a lot of different other kind of game genres that you wouldn't have considered. I put walking simulators on there as an example. There's visual novels that you might not have considered. Communication RPG where there's no battle system whatsoever and it's just walking around and talking to people. These are perfectly legitimate, and I want you to really be creative when you're making games like these. Just make sure that it's within the theme. You'll be judged on whether it's going to be based off of the theme or not, and so forth. I also want to make sure that when you're thinking of a game idea, that you scope the game properly. I mean, time and resources are incredibly short. If you're doing Compo, you're just one person and you have only 25 hours. If you're doing Jam, you're basically working at a team of probably less than 10 people. Heck, probably less than 5 people, to be completely honest. Probably less than 5 people, and you're trying to make it within 38 hours. So trying to make games like Halo or World of Warcraft is just not possible. I do not in the slightest recommend thinking of games like that. But you know what games are really good? Mobile games. Angry Birds is a great example of trying to make a great Ludum Dare game example. Granted, you're not going to be able to make all 178 levels. That's just an arbitrary number, but you're not going to be able to have the time to make all 178 levels, but you can easily make an Angry Bird-like game. And honestly, a lot of mobile games that you find on the app market is actually really good examples of what kind of game scopes you're going to be aiming for. Mainly speaking, you want to make sure that you're making a game that's either a demo, a minigame, or an experiment. Trying to make a bigger game is going to hurt you in the long run, so I don't recommend that. This is going to be a very controversial statement here. I personally don't recommend writing a game design document during the brainstorming stages. I get that they're important, and especially when you're working into a team, it's kind of important to make sure that everyone is on the same page, but it takes up a lot of time. Writing takes up a lot of time, and I just don't do it. And I think I'm better off not doing it. So that's just my opinion, but I'm going to put that out of the way. I'm also going to say that when you're describing a game idea, when you have like a game idea, that you always want to mention how the game is going to be played. This is as simple as, it's going to be a platformer. Oh, it's going to be a twin stick shooter. Heck, it can be as complicated, or you control a bunch of synchronized characters at once while taking advantage of their strength. Be creative about it. Just make sure that you provide some details about how you're going to play the game. Making a game just based off of aesthetics, like, oh, it's going to be a surrealistic game, is going to be incredibly hard for at least a programmer or whoever the game constructor is going to be. It's going to be very difficult for them to actually make the game. If you're telling them this is how you play it, you at least have the game mechanic in there, and that's a great place to start off with. So I have 2 methods on brainstorming a game, and I'm going to say this before I go further, that I tend to interpret themes very loosely, and I do recommend doing the same thing here. Here's what works for me. I use my main method of coming up with a game idea is I call it the brain dump method, where all I do is open Notepad++, set a timer for 1 hour or 30 minutes nowadays because I'm pretty darn good at this, and when I see the theme, I just write out as many single sentence description of a game as possible. So these game ideas can be something like, oh, it's going to be a space shooter. It's going to be a space shooter in space. It's going to be a space shooter in space of the endless space. Like, literally, I come up with such a huge list of really bad game ideas, but every once in a while, there's going to be like specks of pieces where I'm like, that is actually a good idea. I want to make that. So after you go through this for about an hour, timer goes off, you put your pencils down, and you just go through the list very quickly, you skim through it, and you select the one that is your favorite one. Jamie also has claimed that this is the method he used. We never talked about this with each other, so apparently a lot of people seem to converge on this method as well. The other method I personally like to use is called the Peter Molyneux method. Peter Molyneux, by the way, is a Twitter account that is a parody of Peter Molyneux, and the tendency that the joke that this Twitter has is that it asks some really crazy and useless game mechanic questions, such as what will it be like to throw your own head, or what if in a racing game you are the road? And I just asked this really stupid question, and I try to brainstorm on a game mechanic that attempts to answer that said question. I'm a programmer, and I'm coming from a programmer side of things, and we're usually taught that, hey, when you're making a software, you want to make sure that it's a solution to a problem. This is my method of transforming a game idea into problem solution kind of strategy. So if you're a programmer and you don't like the brain dump method, this is the method I recommend. So I'm going to now switch up to the second half of the phase, called prototyping. And personally, in my opinion, this is by and far the most important part of Ludum Dare. It's going to be the most important 3 hours that you're going to be spending. Extra Credits made this wonderful video called Fail Faster, which the rest of the prototyping portion of the slides is going to basically be a rehash about. But what you want to do when you're creating a prototype is you want to create a demo. A really, really short, stupid demo that demonstrates your idea. And then you play that demo and see if it's fun. Make sure that it's kind of what you had imagined. So I'm going to be going through a few screenshots to demonstrate what kind of prototypes I've made. And excuse me as I kind of dunk a little bit of water for a minute. Nope. So this is a prototype of a game called Galactic Neon. And when I originally made this, I made this in a few hours, really, during Thanksgiving weekend. I only had 6 asteroids, a little circle, a ship, and you can shoot from the ship, and that was about it. I was checking to make sure if I can make a fun twin-stick shooter game. Excuse me, and this was all I had. This is what happened after I spent another 2 weeks on it. So, right after getting that prototype in there, I said, all right, now I'm going to spend a lot more time on it. I know the game is fun, and I just went ahead and went crazy with the graphics. Here's another game that I made for Ludum Dare 29 called The Sentient Cube. You can tell from the graphics that it's incredibly simple. I hate the lighting in this. The shapes are like really stupid. But hey, it demonstrates my idea. I wanted it so that it's kind of like Katamari, and it all worked out. And here's what the final product looks like. I've completely changed the graphics. I had it in like an actual arrow letting you know where the goal was and so forth. Here's another excellent example. It's Flappy Bird for a game, a very WarioWare-esque game I was trying to make called Not a Clone. And the left side is exactly what I started on the first day. This was all I had. The right side is what it turned out to be at the end product. Obviously, it looks a lot better. I mentioned earlier, I use a lot of Kenny assets. This is actually mainly constructed out of Kenny assets, but nonetheless, it looks a lot better from this point. So when you're putting a prototype, you want to put together something that's really fast. Presentation quality isn't important. I know if you're like an artist or a musician, that you want to have like the best quality stuff in there. This is a bad time to do it. Just put in blocks, squares, random textures, any sort of placeholder in there. Make sure that when you create this prototype that you have it done quickly. By the way, win conditions aren't even that important. You saw my Galactic Neon, that didn't have a win condition. But anyways, when you get that prototype done, you want to verify whether that game is what you intended or not. I say whether it's fun or not, but there are some people who wants to make like really boring games or anything like that, just to be more inclusive. When when you make that prototype and you realize it's not quite what you thought it was going to be, I will not be afraid to throw it out. In fact, I highly recommend that you throw it out. A lot of the game jams will say, you know, once you get something done really fast, they'll say, and if it didn't turn out the way it is, I would just throw it out. So I highly recommend this strategy and just move on to the next game idea. I also want you to, when you're constructing these kind of games, to pay attention to any kind of bugs or any kind of accidents or mistakes that there are. Not so much because you want to polish them, but because sometimes when you have like bugs or little accidents, that those kind of become a game on their own. You might end up making a game based off of said bug or said accident. I know I experienced this during a Bacon Game Jam a few months ago. And you also obviously have that famous Rockstar story where there was a bug with the police cars, and they made Grand Theft Auto off of that. So now we're going into phase 2. We already have what kind of game idea that we want to make. We have a prototype and we're convinced that it's really good. We're convinced that it's going to be a good game. So where do you go from there? You actually start working on, okay, these are the feature sets that are necessary. These are the features that I think will really help the game. You write up a list of this. I highly recommend using a task tracker like Trello. Trello is a free task tracker that you can go online and make a free account. Paper is just fine too. You want to basically just write down a list of what you think is going to help improve the game. And then you want to start determining which one is the most important. You want to prioritize, in other words. And you start working on the highest priority feature and start going down the list. I am going to say that personally, I find this part to be one of the easier parts of development, but in regards to prioritization and so forth, if a feature there's a high priority feature that you're having trouble implementing, and there's a lot of if there isn't a lot of dependencies to it. When I speak of this, I mean like if there isn't a few other features that relies on this feature being implemented, and it's taking forever to work on it, then I would recommend skipping over it and just going to the next feature. You want to be able to save as much time as possible, and sometimes it turns out to be that feature isn't nearly as important as you thought. And there also is the fact that personally, when trying to work on a feature, I give it like a 1 hour time frame. If I cannot make a feature within an hour, then I just skip it entirely. So you want to have like a sort of a deadline when implementing each feature. Right after that, we jump right into level construction. This is probably the first time out of the entire game development point where I actually pull out a pencil and some paper. I personally recommend graph paper in this case. And what I do is I just sketch out kind of like an aerial view or profile view of the level, depending on what perspective it is, even if it's in 3D, which is usually the kind of medium I make anyways. If you're making it in 3D, kind of like the aerial view is kind of the best way to do so. When you're constructing a level, you want to kind of ask a question, what is the experience you want to convey in this level? What is the kind of story that you want to convey in this level? I personally think of it as, there's this great game mechanic I have in mind that I want to combine in this and this in fashion, so that it has to go through this and this step. And I make a level out of just that. You want to make sure that when you're making said level, like it's tight, it makes sense why that level exists. So that's why I have that kind of strategy. And I personally recommend designing the middle and the last set of levels first, basically the last set of levels instead of working on the first few. This might sound like a really weird question, but the first few levels are actually kind of the most important, and this is the parts where you want to mess up the least. And honestly, one thing I found was when I'm making a bunch of levels, the first set of levels I make are the ones I mess up the most. So that's why I tend to reserve the first few levels as last. Excuse me as I drink a little bit of water. Apologies for that. So let me quickly go over what I do for the first few levels and kind of explain why, what my thoughts and methodology is as to the reasoning as to why I do this. Usually when I'm making the first level specifically, I do it to provide some very, very, very basic instructions on how to move a character, or how to complete a level. I do not assume that the player knows how to play an FPS, a platformer, etc. I actually tell them you have to push the WASD keys, or you have to push the arrow keys right then and there, because some people genuinely do not know. By the by, since I suspect most of your games is going to be played on a keyboard, it might be worth considering that your keyboard has like a million buttons at once, and that itself is very intimidating. So just letting them know, hey, push this button, is actually a huge relief to the player. So I highly recommend that. I also make the first level wide, simple, and focused. By that I mean there's no way they're going to be distracted, there's no way they're going to die, there's a goal in front of them, and the whole thing is you just walk to the goal. That in and of itself is rewarding for beginner players, and a very minor annoyance for professional ones, because they'll just look at it and they'll go, oh, that's just it, straight, done. And so long as the level itself is short enough, then they're not going to have a problem with that. The wide part, by the way, is to let beginning players get used to the controls. So that's why I usually make wider levels in the beginning. Then I go jump to the second level, where I now provide a new set of instructions, new set of controls, indicating, letting them know that this is a unique mechanic in the game, and this is something that you want to lose. You want to also kind of let them practice on movement a little bit about this, but this is a good level to introduce switches. This is a good level to introduce some sort of, this thing you have to carry from here to there, or that kind of stuff. This is a good point to kind of let them know that this game is going to be a lot more complicated than what you just saw previously. And the third level, usually when you get up to the third level, that's like 5 minutes into the game. That's when I say, bam, this is why you want to play this game. This is the selling point. This is the one level where it suddenly goes incredibly crazy, and the player who now are accustomed to the controls and the unique mechanics that you've given to them can now orient themselves and figure out, okay, how do I get past this crazy level that I have no idea what's going on? So that's usually my strategy on that regards. Now we move on to phase 4. Phase 4 is polish. These include replacing all placeholder and sound effects. I also highly recommend spending this time to add something called Juice. There's a great presentation called Juice It or Lose It, but in brief, Juice is a kind of feedback. These are like camera shakes, screen flashes, occasional pause in time, or particle effects, explosions, animations, so forth. Any sort of polish, that graphical or audio polish, that makes a player go, wow, I did something. So I highly recommend checking out that video later on after this live stream. I also spend the time to adjust the level difficulty. This happens often. Usually during when I'm constructing a level, I just construct it and then I say, okay, is this playable? Can I get to the end? All right, I'm done. And then on the polish stage, I go back to it, I revisit it and say, okay, what can I do to improve this? What can I do to make it easier to guide the player to where the goal is, and so forth. And obviously, this is also where I start doing bug fixes as well. Submission process, this is easily the most shortest part of the whole Ludum Dare thing. I personally recommend uploading it to any sort of game market portals like itch.io, GameJolt, Congregate, etc. You want to make sure that your game is available for free immediately. You want to make sure also that there's the least amount of friction going into that website. So itch.io, for example, will have like a name your price thing. I don't recommend turning that on during the duration of the voting period for Ludum Dare. I will just say make it free entirely. But there's a good reason why I recommend these kind of game portals. You want to get as many people to play your game as possible, and when you're putting in these game portals, you're going to have a lot of people who are just curious and you eventually play them. And by doing so, you get a lot more feedback than just from Ludum Dare itself. If this doesn't work out because honestly you had to create like a game developer account for these, and if you don't happen to have the time, then you can always use Dropbox, Google Drive, etc. There's no reason not to use those either. It's just there's more advantages of using game portals instead. So I'm going to go over some compo and jam specific points. Give me a minute as I drink a little bit of water and I'll get back to you. So on Compo, you need to wear a lot of hats. You need to know how to code, or at least how to construct a game out of Construct 2, for example, seeing that that doesn't have any code whatsoever. You need to learn how to code. You need to learn how to make art. You need to learn how to make music. So at this point, you want to really research on your tools like right now. You want to commit to something, go through the tutorials, learn them to prepare as much as possible. When the actual Ludum Dare is going on, I personally found that it's very easy to time, especially since it is an online jam and it's not something where, there's going to be a person walking around and letting you know if you made it to the halfway point. You want to be like really, you want to pace yourself. You want to make sure that you're working off of a schedule. And, you might as well set up a timer if you have to, because it's a good place to kind of remind you, oh, you're at a halfway point. Oh, you're at you're at the polished base point, or something to that effect. You basically want to be able to keep track of time well. When you're constructing your game, I'm going to say you should always have graphics and sound for everything. Even if they're placeholders, having a placeholder itself is much better than having no graphic or sound effect. I know a lot of people posting in the I'm in will mention something like, hey, I don't think I have the time to make sound effects. Bad reasoning. Pull it in. Download BFXR, push that generate a sound button, export it to Wave, use it in your game, and then later replace it during the polishing phase. If it turns out you don't have the time to do it in polishing phase, you still have a sound effect in there. You still have something that makes a person go, okay, I did something in there, and those kind of feedbacks stacks up, and they're very important. That said, since the prototyping and the level design phases, in my personal opinion, are the most important parts, most important phases of development, I would only focus on polishing, like adding kind of the juice, or really working on animation for Compo, that is. For Compo, only during the last phase, the last half day that you have. So I wouldn't worry too much about quality throughout the development, with an exception of the very last few hours. The very last several hours. For jams, you don't have the problem of having all the stress or having all the expertise on you. But what you do have is you now have a stress of dealing with other team members. So when you're creating a game within your team members, I highly suggest that you make a game that all of your team members can agree with. The best ideas, honestly, are ones that really inspires them to make the game. Like if they're saying stuff like, "Oh man, wouldn't it be great if we did A, B, or C?" Or like, "What if we added into this move that you can do by pressing this keyboard combination?" Like these are good. They're already devoted. They're already encouraged into making the game. So these are incredibly good signs. These are the kind of game ideas that you want to make. During the feature implementation phase as well, you want to be careful. You want to be able to discuss within all the team members and make sure that they understand what is the discuss with them all the features that they want to put in there, and then start prioritizing them, start making agreements between, okay, these are more important and these are not nearly as important. Make sure everyone is in the same page when they're doing that. And when you're dealing with team members, you want to be able to divide their job on what seems to make sense to them. So you want to divide the jobs based on category. You want to make sure that, let's say if you have 2 artists in your team, that they don't end up making the main character, both of them, because at that point, once they're done, they'll be fighting over each other on which one's the better one to put into the game. You want to make sure that they don't end up doing the duplicate work. So my personal favorite combination is to have one person focus on programming, one person on sound effects and music, and one person on artwork. Do what works for you. Definitely give these jobs based on their strengths and not to their weaknesses. But regardless, you want to make sure that whatever job they're doing is not conflicting in one another, that they're not doing the 2 of the same thing at once and wasting time as a consequence of that. Lastly, last 2 points for jam stuff, you want to make sure that everyone is on schedule. I would recommend having one person devoted to keeping track of time. And this actually is not a very hard job. You can easily do it while you're doing programming or that kind of stuff. But nonetheless, have someone like, set up a quick timer, make sure everyone's on track, and keep your team updated on, when you reach the halfway point, when you reach the 3/4 point, and so forth. And since you have the luxury to use outside resources, now will be a good time to Google as many websites as possible to get libraries of free graphics, sound effects, scripts, and music, like right now. Just please, again, I'm going to reiterate here that during your voting phase, if you are using outside resources, you must opt out of the category. This recommendation would especially apply to programmers because they need a lot of placeholder art. So if they have like graphics taken from some outside library that's going to later be replaced by an artist, that's actually a really good thing. One, because the programmer now has some sort of art to implement in the game, and two, the artist has a better idea